Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode. Before we jump in, I want to tell you I'm working on creating a Patreon account. I have a ridiculous amount of material and information that I've gathered over the last 17 years or so of research. Some of that is the result of going down endless rabbit holes. Obviously, not everything can make it into the episodes, but I would still love to share it all. And most of it pertains to the 93 men anyway. So the Patreon is a great way to share episode extras, court documents, letters, reading lists, side stories, and I guess whatever else I want to share. Today's story will actually have several things available in the Patreon account, but I'm also going to add things from previous episodes as well. I'm not sure if I'll have everything ready to go by the time this episode comes out, but I'm going to try. So $5 a month will get you access to all these extra goodies. So I'm looking forward to being able to share a lot more with you guys than just the episodes themselves. Thanks so much, and let's get on with the episode. This one about John Craig, Folsom's third execution, that took place on June 12, 1896. John Craig's story has ties to some pretty historically significant events, both in the U.S. and California, especially Los Angeles. To begin, I have to go back to 1846 and tell you about 15-year-old William Hunter, who grew up Mormon in the Midwest. Now, Mormonism was a relatively new religion then, barely older than William himself, so he and his family were some of the very first followers of Brigham Young. About 11,000 Mormons lived in Nauvoo, Illinois in early 1845, but they were violently driven out by, non-Mormons, and they began looking for a new place to settle. And at that time, the Western expansion movement was well on its way and very enticing, so they had their eyes set on California. Brigham Young wanted help in migrating, though, and he was encouraged to seek assistance from leaders in Washington, D.C. Not long after, in May of 1846, the U.S. declared war against Mexico, and in June, President James Polk proposed to the migrating Mormon pioneers, given their shared interests in the West, that they could help him defend the U.S. against Mexico. So the Mormon Battalion, the only religious unit in U.S. military history, was created. It consisted of roughly 550 volunteers, led by Mormon company members and under the direction of U.S. Army officers. Young himself chose the company leaders, one of them being Jesse D. Hunter, William's father, who led Company B. It's said that about 33 women accompanied them, as well as about 50 children. 20 of the women served as laundresses, one of whom was Jesse's plural wife. William was listed as a company officer, the drummer or musician. They traveled about 2,000 miles, partook in some battles, blazed some trails, and arrived in San Diego on January 29th, 1847. The plural wife didn't make it. She died after giving birth to a son she named Diego, who was adopted out. San Diego, California. Imagine it in the 1840s, absolutely gorgeous, and many of the men and their families were mesmerized by the Pacific Ocean. While some of the men wanted to re-enlist, most of them did not. Less than half followed young to Utah because when most of them saw San Diego, they said, "No, I think I'm good. I'm staying here." In July of 1847, a year after the battalion was formed, it was officially decommissioned. Those who stayed, like Jesse and William, participated in public service projects, built some of the first brick buildings in San Diego, a first in the state, really. In fact, Company B built the first courthouse in San Diego. Jesse D. Hunter then was appointed Indian agent, a kind of mediator between local native tribes and those coming onto their land, so to speak. And eventually, Jesse's other wife, William's mother, and the rest of his many siblings joined them. The government handed out bonuses, bounty land, about 160 acres. And in 1852, when Jesse Hunter brought his family to Los Angeles from the Mormon settlement in San Bernardino, it was there that Hunter is credited with bringing brick manufacturing to Los Angeles, building the first brick house in LA, where he and his family lived. It was located at West 3rd Avenue in Maine. Today, you'll find the Ronald Reagan State Building in this intersection. In 1856, Daddy Jesse acquired quite a bit of land. He had sold the brick business by then, and it said he made quite a lot of money mining gold. When he died in 1871, his widow sold off a decent chunk that was developed into the Hunter View Tract Division. There was still plenty of land to play with, and William, along with his brothers, Asa, Samuel, and Jesse, all bought and sold various lots and acreage all over Los Angeles between the 1870s and about 1933. These areas included present-day Mount Washington, Cypress Park, Glassell Park, parts of Glendale, and Calabasas, just northwest of LA. And the market was pretty hot for them for a long time, and they did quite well for themselves. In 1860, William was now 29, and he married 17-year-old Mary, another Mormon who made the trek 10 years earlier, and they had 4 children. Their names were Joe, George, Jesse, and Emily. And the Hunters were a pretty big deal. They helped build LA. William's brother, Asa, had 8 kids with a Hispanic woman. A girl, really. She was 15, and he was 22. And they had lots of grandkids, one of whom was Harbin Hunter, and he became a well-known architect in LA. And in 1929, built and lived in the Brentwood home of 12305 5th Helena Drive, known as the Marilyn Monroe house, where, in 1962, she lived and died in. There's a family crest at the Monroe house, the Hunter family crest, featuring 3 greyhounds on a shield with the motto, Cursum Perficio, translated by descendants of the family as, "I will complete the course," or "I will accomplish the race." Definitely perseverance. And I can tell you that that was the theme within the Hunter family, because they endured a lot. Some of it, their own doing perhaps. The main ranch, referred to as the Corralitos Ranch or Corralitos Canyon, was on about 500 acres that spanned both sides of the Los Angeles River, half a mile west of San Fernando Road, in an area once known as Tropico, a small agricultural town that was eventually consolidated with Glendale in 1918. Their property included what is now Elyria Canyon Park. Several of the Hunters lived in different homesteads on the property, which was in the family until, I believe, 1933. it appears that Asa's kids were a bit more put together than their cousins. William's kids seemed to struggle, at least constantly finding themselves in precarious situations. And they definitely weren't doing the Mormon thing anymore. At least I never saw any reference to the religion in newspapers or transcripts. Not far from the ranch was the notorious 3 Mile House, a very seedy saloon or den that one historian described as, quote, the kind of place where you went for a wild night and counted yourself lucky if you ended up bloodied instead of dead. And that was a very accurate description given what I found on the place. William's son, Joe, a constable or sheriff's deputy, would host dances in an empty building on their ranch and parties in his house. Those nights ended with a stop at this nefarious establishment, and for at least one dance attendee named Charlie Glass, it didn't end well. There's a link in the show notes for that story. This saloon figured into many murders, and it was very accurate when one paper wrote in 1898, the Hunter family has had bad luck to be involved in most of the tragedies associated with the bar's bloody history. I don't think it was just bad luck. Even Joe was acquitted of a murder that involved this saloon. A verdict I question, but as they say, if the glove don't fit. In fact, I will add a file in the Patreon with all the information about that murder, and I'll let you decide for yourself, and maybe if you want to do some digging of your own. So going back, William and Mary Hunter were living the dream in the 1880s. Then their 18-year-old daughter Emily, their youngest, met 30-year-old John Craig, a native of Ohio, and they married on her 19th birthday, December 8th of 1884. It was an odd pairing. She came from this very prominent family, and John had 4 other siblings, all from Illinois, came solo to California 2 years prior, and in that time established a reputation as kind of a jerk, a very drunk jerk. But they ended up together, and in January of 1885, William gave Emily and John one of their properties, a home at 727 Buena Vista Street, about 3 miles southwest of the ranch. Today, you'll find a 727 Buena Vista Street in Magnolia Park, north of Griffith Park, but the one in our story was downtown, an east-westbound road between Broadway and New High Street that ran between Temple, where West Cesar Estrada Chavez Avenue is now, and the LA River, where it stopped. Today, that would be Broadway. The home itself was between Alpine and Ord. A little over a year and a half later, John and Emily had a son, and 2 years later, in 1888, another son, then a girl in 1892. A report would later state, it was not long before Emily discovered that she had made a mistake in her marriage, and that she had wedded a man of domineering ways and fierce temper. John Craig was fault-finding, mean in his disposition, and above all, decidedly brutal. Unfortunately, she evidently stayed, thinking it best for the children. It sounded like most of the Hunter family merely tolerated him, but he and Emily's brother Joe seemed to get along best. During these early years of their marriage, John had been arrested for a couple of fights. There was a charge of battery in 1887, but it was dismissed. I'm not sure who made the initial charges. Somehow, although perhaps not surprising, he became a police officer in May of 1889. This snippet from the LA Herald sums up his 3.5 years on the force. His record as an officer of the law was bad. He always showed himself to be a cruel, heartless, bullying, tyrannical man with no sense of justice, no appreciation of other people's rights, and with no sympathy for the unfortunate poor. John Craig was always getting into trouble. Seldom a day passed but what some complaint was made to the chief of police against him. He was transferred from beat to beat, but every place he went, he made enemies. His actions were investigated many times, but he always managed to creep through some loophole. One of his principal methods was to bully witnesses against him. They feared him, for they knew his peculiar traits. And it gets worse, actually. He was a coward when he encountered anyone of a determined mind. Old and feebled persons, women and children, were the persons over whom he dominated and over whom he seemed to take an especial delight in insulting and abusing. But he wasn't all bad. Even though he was let go for being, quote, unreliable and ineffective, he excelled in one area. You see, when you're a law enforcement officer who hates women, what better place to patrol than the red light district? In this case, on New High Street downtown. The paper wrote, the only credit he ever secured on the ground of efficiency was when he was detailed to clear New High Street of the unfortunate women who frequented that portion of the city for many years. He could drive women out without mercy. His conduct toward the unfortunate persons along that street was inhumane and brutal. But he enforced orders given him, and that was what people call law. So, a real class act, that John. After his dismissal, he was arrested for punching a saloon owner he had once arrested. Craig was found to be the aggressor, big surprise, and was fined $10, about $350 today. All of this, however, would not prevent him from being made a deputy U.S. Marshal the following year, July 1894, during a railroad strike that lasted about a week. As you might imagine, the Craig household wasn't a happy one. So finally, in the spring of 1894, after nearly 10 long years of marriage, Emily filed for divorce, citing cruelty, and her request was granted. John was booted from the home, and Emily transferred the deed to the home on Buena Vista Street back to her father and mother. She spent a month in San Francisco with the kids, no doubt a respite from John. Then in late May, moved to the ranch where her brother George lived. He was 32, and by this time, George had experienced a lot of tragedy of his own, and unfortunately, more to come. His wife had passed away 2 years prior, and the couple had 5 children, but 2 of them died before the age of 2. Another daughter would later die at age 20 in 1910, but for now he had 2 young boys and a young girl when Emily and her 3 kids came. He eventually found his own place in town in early July. William and Mary moved into the home on Buena Vista Street, and all seemed fine until July 10th, when William, now John's former father-in-law, filed a complaint in court against John for malicious mischief, breaking into the home. That day, William had given John a typed note forbidding him from coming anywhere near the home. William informed John that he was now the lawful owner of the home, and if John wished to collect his belongings, William, or one of his authorized agents, had to be present. It was early evening, around 6:30 or 7, on July 25th, 1894, when John arrived at the Hunter Ranch in a one-horse buggy. Willie, his oldest at 7, was playing outside with his cousin, 4-year-old Walter, one of George's sons, and the only one of his 3 kids that were there that day. John called to Willie to come over, but Willie ran inside to tell his mother, 28-year-old Emily. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner with the house servant, 20-year-old Albertina, or Tina Jensen, whose sister was married to Mary Hunter's brother. Tina took Willie and his 5-year-old brother Johnny to a bedroom and told them to hide under the bed. She came back and watched the scene unfold. John peered through the kitchen window and spotted his 2-year-old daughter Edna. She saw him and giggled as he made silly faces at her. He opened the screen door, but the glass pane door was locked. Emily had just locked it. She then moved aside the red curtain and peered at John, asking him what he wanted. He told her he wanted to see his children, but Emily refused. She said, "You know there's a man here." He replied, "What man?" And, as if on command, George appeared outside on the far end of the porch. The men weren't exactly friends and had had recent run-ins in the town. John backed up as George approached, and it's a matter of debate on whether or not anything was said between them. Emily unlocked the door and let George in, and closed it again. All within about 30 seconds, George walked down the hall to a coat rack, grabbed his coat, put it on, and walked back to the door. What exactly happened isn't entirely clear, but this is what is thought to have happened. George pulled open the glass pane door, opened inside and to his right. Then he pushed the screen door out, open to his right, so it stood between him and John. He took one step out when John shot him through the screen door. The bullet entered below his right eye and traversed downward, lodging in his throat. He fell forward onto the porch. Emily's instinct appeared to be to stoop forward, as if to try to catch George before he fell, and she reached out to push the screen door out more, as it had started to swing back closed. As she did, John shot her, also in the face. The bullet entered below her left eye and out the back of her head. They both had severe powder burns on their faces, indicating they were shot at close range. As we'll learn, what exactly Willie and his younger brother saw isn't clear. According to Tina, the first shot came from the gun in John's right hand, and that he took 2 steps forward and shot Emily with the gun in his left hand. It happened all rather quickly. She said John then stepped over Emily's body, raised 2 pistols, and said, "I've got enough revolvers for the whole family." He accused Tina of being against him too, and that he was going to kill her. She said she shoved one of his hands away and bolted out the front door, leaving the children, who gathered around their mother and uncle and were screaming and crying. She ran the 1/4 mile to Asa Hunter's house, Emily's uncle. Willie said his father had a 3rd gun, a white-handled one, sticking out of his back pocket. He noticed it, he said, because his father wasn't wearing a coat. What happened next, of course, is up for debate, which I'll get into, but we do know that Willie ran past Tina, saying, "Papa is coming down the road. Papa has untied and is coming," meaning he's untied his horse and is on his way. They got to Asa's house and told him what happened. As John fled in his buggy, he passed Jesse Hunter, George's and Emily's brother, coming toward the ranch. He had no idea what had occurred, and since the men weren't on good terms, they didn't stop and chat. Jesse, often referred to as Captain Hunter, or Cap, also had no idea what was about to happen. But meanwhile, Asa Hunter hopped on a horse, bareback, and immediately went to the ranch, where he found George still alive but unconscious. His face was pressed down on the porch, and Asa moved his head so he could breathe better. Asa's 2 grown sons arrived and, with 2 neighbors, carried George inside. Willie covered his uncle up in a blanket. The children, including George's son Walter, the 4-year-old, who was outside the whole time, were taken to Asa's house. Asa then saddled up and went after John. John rode the 3 miles into town to the house on Buena Vista Street, where 63-year-old William and 51-year-old Mary Hunter now lived. It took about 20 to 30 minutes, and it was dark. He stopped at the neighbor's house, Miles A. Long, who was also a special officer and had known John and Emily for several years. He knew about their troubles, often witnessed to them, and since the divorce, John had discussed his heartache with the neighbor. John handed the reins of the horse to Long, asking him if he'd take the animal to the stable between the houses. He thought it was odd, but John appeared drunk, which was not unusual, so he just went ahead and did it. Then moments later, he heard 7 or 8 gunshots and ran to the front of the house, where he found John lying on the front porch moaning and saying, "This is terrible, this is terrible." John had a flesh wound on the side of his head. Miles grabbed a gun that was lying near John, who attempted to snatch it first. And with the help of another neighbor who arrived, he took John to his house. Long's wife got him cleaned up while he telephoned police. In the meantime, neighbors discovered the 2 bodies on the porch. Only 2 of those 7 or 8 bullets actually took effect, 1 in each of them. William Hunter was shot in the back, and the bullet that killed Mrs. Hunter entered the front of her chest and traveled through her spine. Just as officers had a hold of John and were carrying him toward the patrol wagon, Asa Hunter arrived, not yet knowing what happened to his parents, and told officers to not let him go because he had just killed Emily, and likely his nephew. And then, of course, he saw what happened to his parents. A Los Angeles Herald reporter was there quickly and described the scene as resembling a butcher's stall. Within half an hour, roughly 500 people had gathered around the house, and officers struggled to keep them all back. When police searched John, they found a box containing 32 and 38 caliber bullets, as well as a typewritten note. The note that William Hunter wrote to John on July 10th, warning him to stay away from his old house. He didn't say much that night, claiming the wound on his head prevented him from hearing any questions asked of him. But then the next morning, John gave a rambling and sometimes incoherent statement to the Herald reporter. He accused George of pulling a gun on him and said, "When a man has got any children, he has got the right to see them. A man's got some feelings when he's got children. And I've got some feelings." There was no gun found on George. John said the hunters treated him like a dog, but that he was willing to die for what he might have done. He claimed he didn't know any more than what the reporter knew, and as for Emily, he said, "I love that woman, if ever a man loved. The old folks were to blame for keeping me from my children. My wife was always good to me, and if she's dead, I want to die too." And if she was dead, it was an accident, he said. He complained of pain from his head wound, the origins of which varied. At first, he was heard saying he tried to kill himself after killing the elder hunters. Then to the reporter, said William grabbed one of his guns and shot at him. But the gunpowder burns on his face indicated it was self-inflicted. He wanted to be clear about one thing, though, that he was a brave man and no coward. There are mixed opinions on whether or not he was drunk, but one consensus among most of the officers was that John was, quote, a treacherous and unprincipled man, and they shook their heads when they heard of the murder and remarked that it was no more than what could be expected. George, meanwhile, was hanging on, persevering, as the hunters always seemed to do. The bullet was just lodged in his throat, and he was in a lot of pain and very weak, and remembered next to nothing of what happened, but said he wasn't afraid of John and didn't think he would ever do something like that. With his head bandaged, and he was shielded by an umbrella held by a deputy, John was brought into court that afternoon for arraignment. He was charged with just the murder of William, reserving the other murders for potential charges should he somehow escape the death penalty. One paper wrote of John's demeanor after being brought back to jail after his arraignment, quote, so great was his craven satisfaction at being again in the confines of the county jail that he laughed like a hysterical schoolgirl, then slunk into his corner and refused to budge. The angry mob outside terrified him, and he expressed little remorse over his actions and refused to talk other than to whine about his head pain. Quote, he is kept confined in a tank much like a wild beast, and no one is allowed to see him. His life is that of a caged animal, which has very little in it of interest. The coroner's inquest was also held that day, and Tina Jensen told how John came inside the kitchen, guns blazing and threatening to kill her. Willie said he ran into the house and told his mother that his father had arrived. She had said a bad word and told Tina to take him and Johnny to another room and hide them under the bed. According to Willie, he had heard his mother tell his father that if he wanted to see the children, he'd have to see the boss, meaning George. He stayed under the bed, or at least in the bedroom, until he heard the first shot, then came in the kitchen just as his mother was shot. Tina didn't know when the two boys emerged from the bedroom, but that all three, Willie, Johnny, and Edna, were either in the kitchen and dining room after the shootings. Willie described his father walking inside after both shootings, asking his 5-year-old brother Johnny if he wanted to go into town. He said no. Then John picked up Edna, kissed her, and placed her back down. Tina Jensen didn't mention this in her testimony, but Willie did corroborate her statement that John threatened her. However, did not mention his father coming in with 2 guns blazing and saying he had enough guns for the whole family. When asked why Willie didn't go to his father when he first arrived, Willie said, "Because Mama didn't want me to, because she was afraid he would take me home." He said how his father would use very bad words with his mother, but he never saw him strike her. Miles Long then gave his testimony, and a few others who said John often discussed his marital woes with them. John and his attorney, G.A. Williams, attended, but they remained quiet throughout the proceedings. At his preliminary hearing on July 31st, the courtroom was packed, mostly with men, and they were freely talking about lynching John. One reporter gave his very astute observation of the case when he wrote, "Whiskey, love, and divorce were never known to exist together without trouble." And he wasn't wrong. John arrived without an attorney, but District Attorney Davis and J.R. Rush appeared for the prosecution. Just as Tina Jensen had started giving her version of events, attorneys G.A. Williams and B.W. McIntosh pushed through the crowd, saying they were appearing for the defendant. They tried to show that the second shot John fired at the ranch was meant for George, not Emily. John also claimed the murder of Mary was an accident, that William came after him with a cane, and when John raised his left arm in defense, the gun in that hand somehow went off, and the bullet inflicted his head wound before making its way to Mary. Then another bullet hit William in the back. It was decided, though, that John would be tried for the murder of Emily instead of William, a charge seemed more likely to garner a conviction. He faced another arraignment on August 7th, and trial was set for mid-September. Meanwhile, poor George. He was still alive, but very weak and unable to remember much. The press said he had completely lost his mind and was in a stupor. He wasn't able to sit up or communicate very well, or even understand everything told to him. Doctors were not able to remove the bullet from his throat. Some thought he might have swallowed it, but I never did find out. And at this point, he still didn't know what had happened to his sister and parents. But don't worry, George was pretty tough. He took that family motto very seriously. While awaiting trial, John grew out his beard, which apparently was fully gray, almost white, the result of which brought on by fright, or so the papers said. Everyone liked the idea that John was so petrified his hair was turning white, but he didn't seem frightful. His demeanor was described as nonchalant, and that he spent his time reading newspapers, clipping out articles about himself. And evidently his attorneys, well aware of the fight ahead of them, withdrew from the case. So Judge McKinley appointed former Deputy District Attorney George P. Phibbs and F.B. Guthrie to defend him. They asked for more time, which they received, and trial was set for November 12th. John was said to have spent his time in jail expecting to be treated like a king, and when he wasn't, he'd, quote, cry like a baby and whine and complain. In October, he woke the whole jail up with what was called an epileptic fit, writhing and screaming, appearing as if he had been poisoned. He recovered and claimed he had been prone to these fits in the past. Judge B.N. Smith presided over the trial, and the prosecution was conducted by Deputy D.A. M.W. Conkling and Henry T. Gage. Attorney John Stone Johns joined Phibbs and Guthrie for the defense. It was standing room only, and at some point during the trial, a few of the glass panes in the courtroom door were shattered because people had been pushing and shoving their way to get inside. John didn't appear too concerned. He didn't even seem to notice his son, who sat not far behind him. Tina Jensen, described by reporters as having a fair amount of good looks, testified, giving her story, which didn't vary from her inquest testimony. Throughout these cases, reporters almost always reserved a little extra space in their articles to describe the appearances of female witnesses, what they were wearing, their demeanor, and most definitely, their level of attractiveness. On cross-examination, she said there was a gun in the Hunter house, a white or pearl-handled one, that was found after the killings in a bedroom drawer. George's nurse later moved it to its usual place inside a clock in another room. It was later explained that the gun was moved by Emily shortly before the murders when all the men were away and she was alone at the ranch with the kids, and that George didn't even know that it was in the drawer. Further, the gun didn't appear to have been fired or that it even worked properly. Two bartenders testified John had asked them, separately, on July 25th if he could borrow their gun, and they obliged. Officer Harvey Davis said he saw John 3 times that day. At 5 p.m., they chatted in the plaza downtown, and he told the officer he was going into the country in his capacity as a deputy marshal to go after some people. Now, he had been made a deputy marshal, but that was only during the railroad strike between July 11th and the 18th. Davis saw John 30 minutes later, this time driving a horse and buggy. The third time was during his arrest and appeared to him as possibly drunk. Not staggering drunk, but he was a man that could drink a lot without showing it. The arresting officer, W.H. McKeague, testified he didn't think John was drunk at the time, and when asked if he had ever seen him drunk, said, "I don't know that I ever did." I imagine there was a collective eye roll in the courtroom. Testimony from the Hunter family included discussing a June 19th visit from John at the ranch to see his kids, and that Mary wasn't thrilled to have him anywhere near the place. Lots of family was there, including Emily, and even though all appeared friendly, Mary wasn't having it. She told him to get the hell out, and if he didn't, she'd horsewhip him. Other Hunter family members, including one of Asa's daughters, also named Emily, talked about the animosity between John and her family. He allegedly told her that if the family continued to treat him poorly and keep him from his kids, that he would put a hole in them. She also said she never paid much attention to anything John said. Miles Long, the next-door neighbor on Buena Vista Street, called to identify the revolvers John had when arrested, but he had difficulty, saying he didn't really pay much attention, and it was dark. The defense objected to most of the questions asked of Long and others about the murder of William and Mary. Evidence from those murders were deemed inadmissible, since John was only being charged with the murder of Emily. Long was asked if John seemed drunk, and to him, he was. Then George Hunter, Mr. Perseverance himself, took the stand. By now, he had recovered a bit. To what extent, I'm not sure, but his memory was indeed poor, and he couldn't hear out of one ear. However, he did recall arriving at the ranch 15 to 20 minutes before, saw John on the back porch, and had walked toward him. He said John was talking to himself, and that no words were exchanged between him and John. He couldn't remember what he had gone inside the house for, but that it certainly wasn't a gun. Then he walked back to the door, and the rest is a blur. A lot seemed blurry for George. Throughout the cross-examination, he gave different answers to the same question over and over, such as if he was wearing a coat or not, or if he had gone to town that day. Either he was messing with the defense or was truly having severe cognitive difficulties. He did talk about a run-in he had with John in town about a week before the killings. Evidently, John had made some comments about George's new girlfriend, an alleged prostitute, and George wasn't too happy about that. He grabbed John's elbow, and John, working as the deputy marshal at the time, showed his gun, and the men parted with just some nasty words. Then Willie Craig, quote, the chubby-faced and bright-looking lad of 8 years, was called to the witness stand. This prompted an hour-long debate among the attorneys and the judge on whether or not an 8-year-old, most third graders today, was competent to testify. There was a law that children under 10 couldn't testify in a trial, but only if they appeared incompetent, and Willie appeared fully self-aware, even if he was repeatedly asked to speak up during his testimony. Quote, there seemed something very pitiful, said the paper, in such a mere child being called to help weave evidence that might mean death to his own father. Willie described seeing his father arrive, how he went inside because he was afraid of his father, and said Tina had taken him and Johnny to a bedroom, but he said he followed her right back out. He said his father kept saying he wanted to see his children, and his mother kept refusing, telling him then that a man was on the ranch. His father asked, what man? It was then that Uncle George appeared and came inside, and Emily closed the door part way. He said George came in, went down the hall and got his coat, then went back outside. Quote, he got one little step, and then Papa shot him. Willie said he saw 3 guns, one in each of his father's hands, and one in his back pocket. According to Willie, his father had a coat on, but during the inquest he had said it was in the buggy. The little boy described how the second shot came as George fell, and his mother, who was behind George, bent forward to catch him, and then she fell. He thought she was fooling around at first. Willie recalled how 18-month-old Edna had picked up her mother's hand and said, Mama is dead. Willie said his papa stepped over the body of his mother and threatened to kill the whole family, starting with Tina. And then he said to Willie, I'll begin with you. He said he ran and his father chased him, but he was able to escape out the front, just as Tina had, maybe less than a minute before. On cross-examination, the defense spent considerable time asking him if he had been coached and what to say. Only to tell the truth of what he saw, he said. The defense asked Willie several times to explain which hand George opened the door with and what his other hand was doing. The prosecution finally stepped in and said he's telling the truth. Mr. Guthrie replied, well, he knows more about it than George did. To which Prosecutor Gage said, after your man has tried to murder him and impaired his intellect. Phibbs said they took exception, and Gage acknowledged it and asked the jury to disregard it. Willie's answers had varied quite a bit from what he told at the coroner's inquest, and Guthrie wasn't about to let that slide. He asked Willie if he had said at the inquest that his father had threatened him, and he replied yes. Guthrie brought out a copy of that testimony and began to read it. Here's what was different. At the inquest, Willie was asked specifically if his father had made any threats toward the children, and he answered, no, sir. Now, at trial, he did corroborate Tina that he had threatened her, but said that she didn't push his hand away. And at the inquest, he said he hadn't come out of the bedroom until after he heard the first shot and arrived in time to see his mother get shot. Now, at trial, he denied saying that. Before, he said he saw his father on the porch after he shot George and also saw George lying on the porch. Yet now at trial, during direct questioning, he said he didn't see his father and couldn't see George because he was lying down. Also at trial, he never mentioned his father asking Johnny if he wanted to come with him or picking up Edna and giving her a kiss. And finally, according to the inquest transcript, Willie's father just said goodbye and left. No threats, no stepping over bodies and waving guns, and certainly no chasing him in the house. Guthrie asked Willie, "Did you tell this story as I have read it here before the inquest?" "Not all of it," he said. "Some." "What part of it did you not tell?" "A good deal of it," he said. When Guthrie read the part about John not saying anything except goodbye, Willie didn't say anything. Guthrie asked him if he had said at the inquest that the reason he didn't go to his father when he first arrived was, quote, "because Mama didn't want me to, because she was afraid he would take me home." Not that he was afraid of him. Willie didn't deny he had said that. While he might not have been afraid of him then, he certainly was now. That ended the questioning and proceedings for the day. When the defense opened, they called John Calluri, who had known John Craig for 6 to 7 years, and he testified how he accompanied John Craig to the ranch on June 19th when Mary Hunter shooed him away, threatening to horsewhip him. Calluri stayed by the buggy, and for at least an hour the scene appeared very friendly. John held his little girl, and he and Emily talked. Then Mama Mary came out of the home and was pretty mad as hell that he was there. After being ordered away, John was teary-eyed. He said Craig had a good reputation and was affectionate with his wife and kids. His testimony was to show that John Craig didn't go to the ranch to start trouble, as Mary often accused him of. And the friend would not only witness that, but also see how mean the hunters were to him. John evidently tried this tactic again on the day of the murders. He stopped at George Payne's house, a neighbor of the hunters, and spoke with Payne's daughter, who told him her father was out in the field and expected back momentarily. But John decided not to wait. He did say he'd stop on his way back. Many of those testifying for the defense were character witnesses, which must have been a stretch given his reputation. But there were a few, mostly store owners or people who had worked with him years earlier. They said he was friendly and very affectionate with his family. Attorney J.M. Brooks testified John had come to him 3 to 4 months before the murders, very depressed over his divorce, and was looking for advice. The prosecution, not seeing the visit to the attorney as proof he attempted a lawful resolution, thought it funny to ask on cross-examination, "Did you advise him to borrow a couple of 6-shooters and go up and see the wife and children with them? Or to arm himself?" An objection, of course. A few days before the murder, John visited another attorney about his predicament. The lawyer told him, "Those children belong to you and your wife together, and the law allows you to see them at any time." But both attorneys said they also were not provided with the full story. And there were plenty of others who said John would bring his young children into saloons and proceed to get drunk. The defense called 6-year-old Johnny, the same defense that fought hard to keep 8-year-old Willie from testifying. It was confusing testimony, though. He did say his father asked him if he wanted to come with him, but it sounded like it was outside, not in the kitchen. Guthrie had succeeded in getting him to admit that Johnny had told him and the other defense attorneys in a previous interview that his father never came in the house. Many of his answers came in head nods or head shakes. What it came down to was that Johnny didn't see much of what happened because his hands were covering his eyes. Press described the event as a pitiful spectacle of a little boy, a mere infant, albeit a sturdy one, standing close up in front of the 12 jurymen, trying with childish tongue to tell his story. The fiend in human guise, as Craig may be, the moment when he bowed his head and wept at the sight of his child testifying was the one in which he has appeared as a true man. But how delightfully thrilling, what a refinement of torture to be imagined by the onlookers. It whetted their appetite for what was to come. And finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for, John Craig took the stand, wearing, by the way, the same clothing he had on the day of the murders. He talked about going out to the ranch on June 19th and that he asked George to help him fix things, but George told him basically, "Sorry, man, I've got troubles of my own." Then Mary started in on him, accusing him of coming out there to start a fuss. He said he didn't say anything, just kissed Willie and Edna and asked to see Johnny, but he wouldn't come out of the house to see him. He told Emily before leaving, "It is awful bad when a fellow comes out here to see his children to be treated this way." And then Mary just wouldn't stop and said, "Don't you never enter your foot in this place again." He claimed he and George had been on good terms up until July 7th or 8th, when George had confronted him in a bar about saying something in regard to George running around with a prostitute, and John denied it and told the jury he was very calm and cordial with George and that George was threatening toward him. He then left. A few days later, on July 11th, the day John was made a deputy marshal for the strike, is when he passed George on the street and George muttered to John that he was an SOB. John made a remark about wanting to see his kids, and George grabbed his elbow and allegedly said, "If you ever come out to that ranch, I will fill you so full of holes that you will never be able to carry them home." And John flashed his gun and badge, and that ended that. On the morning of the murders, John had gone to the marshal's office to get paid for the work he had done and was only able to get half. Shortly thereafter, he said, he ran into an old pal from Illinois named Dwight Ollie, a salesman who had only been in town a couple of days and was heading to San Francisco soon before going back east. He asked John to go with him to Pasadena, but he wanted John to hire a buggy and get some guns, for protection, of course. John, being the obliging friend that he was, said sure, and they would meet around 5 o'clock and head out. John did as he was asked, parked the buggy near the plaza, then ran into Officer Harvey Davis. He denied telling Davis he was going after people, but rather going with people into the country. They parted, and then wouldn't you know it, Mr. Ollie never showed. He had guns, a buggy, a bottle of whiskey, and no place to go. Just like whiskey not pairing well with love and divorce, it didn't go any better with guns and a buggy. From there, John testified, "I drove down Aliso Street and thought I would take a little drive at the start, and I got to studying about my children and wife and thought it would be a good time now, as I had a rig, to drive out and see my children and wife, and knew George and I having this trouble and that he was in town. If I were to go down there would be nobody there but Cap," referring to Captain Jesse, "and I would go and see my children without any trouble." This 3-mile trip from downtown Los Angeles to the ranch near what was then Tropico took about a half an hour. Once there and on the porch, George approached him and asked him what the hell he wanted. John replied he wanted to see his children, and without stopping, George allegedly said, "I'll show you all the children by God you want to see," and went inside. Emily didn't close and lock the door again, but left it slightly open. John said he didn't think the door was closed at all because he watched through the screen door George go down the hall and within 15 seconds come back wearing a coat and now was buttoning it with his left hand, while his right hand was at his side, holding something, possibly something shiny. John claimed to have backed up about 8 feet from the door. He said George stepped out, closed the screen door. He was turning away from John, then twirled around, said something, and that was when John fired 2 shots at him. "They were just as fast as I could shoot them," he said. "I never took my hand down at all." Afterwards, he put the gun in his pocket. Then he said he saw Johnny standing outside. He asked his youngest son if he wanted to go into town with him, and he said no. And then that's when John left. He claimed he never saw Emily after their conversation on the porch, that he only looked at George, and that he didn't even know his wife was dead, but that it was an accident. I fired for protection of my life, he said. I thought my life was in danger. He told the jury he had not taken a step into the house, never saw or spoke to Tina or Willie that day at all, and only had the one gun. He said he had 2 good reasons for not going into the house. One was that the attorneys he consulted previously advised him not to attempt to go inside the house, even if asked, and 2, because George was lying in front of the door. Prosecutor Henry Gage began the cross-examination. He asked, "Did you, on the same night in question, shoot and kill any other members of the family?" Immediate objections. Because he was just being tried for the murder of Emily, the murders of her parents were off limits, irrelevant and immaterial. Objection was sustained. Judge Smith wasn't going to let the prosecution go there. He was then asked how much he drank when he left the ranch, and according to him, just a little from the whiskey bottle, which he claimed to have thrown out well before it was empty. Then Gage tried again. "Did you shoot and kill William Hunter accidentally that night, after you accidentally shot your wife?" Objection. Sustained. "What other accident did you meet with on the night in question, other than the killing of your wife?" Objection. Sustained. "Didn't you have a hat on that night?" John said yes. It was known that John's hat was left at the second murder scene, and Gage wanted to know where it ended up that night. John said he didn't know. This went on, and the defense continued to object. John said he had the hat when he got to town, but from there, he wasn't sure. "Was it near any dead bodies that you missed your hat?" Objection. Sustained. Then Gage asked him from whom he borrowed the pistols. John couldn't remember their names. "Did you borrow them accidentally?" John didn't reply. "Did you put it in your pocket in the afternoon in question, accidentally?" The defense called the questions uncalled for. So Gage said, "Or deliberately." Again, no answer. "Did you put the pistol in your pocket, which you borrowed, accidentally or deliberately?" He responded that he put it in his pocket. As for booze, he said he had 4 to 5 glasses of beer and a couple of drinks of whiskey that day, starting around 10 a.m. Gage asked about the elusive Dwight Ollie, John's supposed friend from Illinois. His attorneys had evidently tried to find him, but weren't able to. Gage asked, "He is a mythical gentleman, isn't he?" "A what?" John asked. And Gage said, "Never mind." John told him he hadn't seen the man in 13 years, so Gage found it strange that John would, at his own expense, rent a rig, procure guns, and head out with this man and go see who knows who, and yet never bothered to ask the man where he was staying in the city. John said he just didn't think to ask. As for the shooting of George, Gage asked him why he didn't just leave when he saw George coming back outside if he feared for his life. "I didn't have time to get away. I thought that if I did attempt to go away, I would get shot in the back, and I thought that I would stand and take it in the front and defend myself as I thought my life was in danger." He said he wasn't expecting George to be there since George had moved into town 2 weeks earlier, and he denied Emily said to him when he arrived, "You know there's a man here." Gage asked him if he knew a man named M.T. Bowler. He said yes, and so Gage asked if he talked to him in the city jail that night, but he said, "I don't remember." Bowler was a police officer John was friends with, and they allegedly had a conversation that night where John said, "You're a friend of mine. I wish you would go out to the ranch and see if you can't find a gun around there. I know the law, and I have got to put up some kind of a defense." John asked Gage to repeat the information, so the court reporter did. John then replied, "I did not nor don't remember having any conversation with him." Court was adjourned for the weekend, and the L.A. Herald provided their sarcastic opinion. No sobs rent his frame as he eyed the quivering form of his unintended victim, but stepping across the dead form of Emily Craig, he cried for vengeance against those whom he believed were keeping him from his loved ones. Breathing out slaughter against his enemies, chasing even his children before him, he would have offered them up, a vast holocaust of blood, and so much for the theory of self-defense. Then he was drunk, most assuredly drunk, insanely drunk, with mental equilibrium upset, but having a steady hand and a steady pair of legs. Is there any incongruity in that? If the ordinary man gets drunk from the legs up, it simply goes to show that Craig is an uncommon man. That's all. On Monday, the prosecution continued their cross-examination of John, asking him more questions about the mysterious Mr. Ollie and who he borrowed the guns from, which he still didn't remember. John also couldn't positively identify the two pistols in court as being the murder weapons. Then Gage asked, like he did with the hat, where he last saw the pistols he borrowed. Objection. Sustained. When that didn't work, Gage asked, that mother-in-law, where is she? That didn't work either. He tried another tactic, asking him where he returned his horse to, which he replied, miles long. Where? Asked Gage. Standing inside of his yard. How far from the place where you left the pistol? That didn't work either. John finally left the stand, and the defense called a few more character witnesses before resting their case. In rebuttal, the prosecution called M.T. Bowler, and he described the conversation he had with John in the jail on the night of the murders. John told him, this is the second time that I have been out there. They ran me off the ranch before, and this time I went prepared for them. Them or him? Gage asked. Bowler explained. He said John told him that Emily had said there was a man on the ranch, contradicting John's testimony that he never heard that. He told Bowler that George shot at him twice, and John said, I pulled my guns and went to work on them. Bowler told the jury that he then asked John how it happened that he killed the, quote, old people, saying that John said, well, I went to see, and this was where Judge Smith interrupted, saying he can't talk about that. Bowler said that John told him, I have acted the man, and I want you to go out to the ranch and get that gun. I know what the law is, and I want to make a defense. He never said anything about shooting George to protect his life. The prosecution called a few more officers and neighbors who testified to John's abysmal reputation, that he was always quarrelsome, and then called James A. Carter, a black man who lived across the street from William and Mary. His testimony was cut short, and the jury was excused while the attorneys and judge debated whether or not legal reference could be made to a crime that occurred after the crime that the defendant was on trial for. The prosecution argued that in doing so, it would prove criminal intent of the first murder, and not that it was an accident. Gage and Deputy D.A. M.W. Conkling said that if John Craig had guns for the whole family, as two witnesses now said, and then proceeded to murder two more family members of the Hunter family, then the shooting of George wasn't self-defense, and certainly no accident that Emily was killed. The defense just simply disagreed. Judge Smith pondered all of this and said, the simple question is whether there was a plan, and we all know that other offenses may be shown if they seem to indicate a plan or a system in carrying out the offense with which the party is charged. He eventually came to the conclusion that he agreed with the prosecution, saying, if ever there was any case where proof of additional homicides was admissible, this is one. Court adjourned until the next day, giving the defense an opportunity to submit an affidavit requesting a 15-day continuance in order to prepare for this now admissible evidence. The defense submitted their affidavit, starting off by reminding the court that they were appointed as John Craig's counsel because he had no money or other means, and thus far, the entire preparation and all expenses have been incurred by them. They pointed out that throughout the proceedings, Judge Smith rightfully ruled that any evidence from the subsequent shootings was inadmissible. Now the defense felt the rug had been pulled out from under them. Not only were they not being paid, they needed time to prepare. This was another level of damage control they weren't prepared for. Back then, there wasn't a lot of case law to consult on this, even if they did have time to look into it. The attorneys had valid concerns and complaints. They were fully expected to spend their own time and money to defend the rights of someone they probably would have preferred not to, while adhering to the Constitution. And this was a very unexpected about-face from Judge Smith. If I may, the Sixth Amendment, ratified in 1791, ensured those accused of a crime the right to a speedy public trial by an impartial jury. It wasn't until 1868, when the 14th Amendment and its due process clause came along, that said states couldn't deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, which included the right to counsel. What it didn't ensure was the quality and adequacy of the attorney or the legal aid provided. In the 1890s, the idea of a, quote, public defender was non-existent, and while the Constitution demanded it, it was up to America to figure out how to implement a system, which arguably has often been challenging for this country. One reason being is our decentralized setup. But somebody in California was on it, and she was a badass. In August of 1893, just over a year prior to John Craig's trial, Clara Shortridge Foltz gave a public address at the Chicago World's Fair to the Board of Lady Managers, presenting her then very radical concept of providing legal representation, equal to that which was provided to the prosecutors, to those accused who couldn't afford an attorney. She argued that resources, funding, should be the responsibility of the state and federal governments. If the government has the burden of proof, shouldn't they shoulder the burdens imposed on the person they're accusing? It was in line with the 14th Amendment. Clara was California's first female attorney, and she practiced in San Francisco and San Diego in the early 1890s and in New York from 1896 to 1899. In 1910, she was appointed to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, the first woman deputy DA in the United States. Through her lobbying, the public defender concept became a reality in Los Angeles County in January of 1914, the first in the country. Oh, and she did it all while raising 5 children by herself. In 2002, the Criminal Courts Building in Los Angeles was renamed the Clara Shortridge Foltz Criminal Justice Center. Now, this is a much bigger and more complex topic than what we have time for, but it is important to note that it wasn't until 1932 when the Supreme Court ruled that both the federal and state governments had to provide legal counsel to those accused of a capital crime. In 1942, another decision from the High Court ruled that the 14th Amendment didn't require states to provide counsel to indigent defendants in all criminal cases, mostly just rape and murder. So anyone facing 30 years for robbery, for instance, wasn't guaranteed legal counsel. That decision was finally overturned in 1963 with the landmark decision in Gideon v. Wainwright that declared the right to counsel was a fundamental right in all states. Oh, and it wasn't until 1984 that the Supreme Court ruled that appointed legal counsel should be reasonably effective. Today, the concept and structure of the public defender is a mixed bag. Some states or counties have a government-funded office, but there's also assigned counsel systems where the court appoints a private attorney And there's the contract service system where attorneys are contracted for a certain amount of time. I should also note that this only applies to the trial and the first appeal of right. The convicted is on their own for any subsequent or discretionary appeals. Today, about 9 out of 10 criminal defendants cannot afford an attorney. Could you? Whether for yourself or a loved one? Lawyers aren't cheap, and court dockets are long. In California alone, public defender offices received 82% less funding than district attorneys' offices. Being underpaid pretty much guarantees being understaffed, which means overworked. These deficits have major impacts: overcrowding, unmanageable caseloads, lack of oversight, inadequate representation, and of course, wrongful convictions. Not having an adequate and equitable public defender system creates an avalanche of consequences for our criminal justice system and society at large. So John Craig's attorneys had a reasonable gripe back in 1894. Just as Ivan Kovalev's appointed counsel in the previous episode had pointed out, John's defense team understood the importance of protecting the rights of the accused. It's easy to dismiss a violation of a defendant's right when one's guilt is fairly well established, but that's not a good precedent, because you will most definitely want those rights afforded to you or to someone you love, your kid, your spouse, your sibling, should any of you find yourself accused of something. If you can't protect them for some, you can't protect them for all. And so while we're not exactly rooting for John Craig, his attorneys were merely trying to protect his right, like they would for anyone. But Judge Smith rejected their request for a continuance, and at this point, the defense didn't know who the prosecution planned to call about the murders on Buena Vista Street. Smith said that should the court not rule correctly, the attorneys had the benefit of filing exceptions or errors, and of course the appeals process. The law gives you that, said Smith. However, we will go on with this testimony, and the people can see about your witnesses for the defense, if you have any. And I had in my mind, in regard to this matter, concluded that if you desire to put in anything in reply, that it would be your right to do so, and you could get your witnesses and see what you could do in that regard. In other words, let's just see how it goes. As for aid or assistance, Judge Smith was baffled. He said the defense has access to the right to subpoena and any other court process, but, quote, as to making an order that this county furnish you with money, I have never done such a thing since I have been on the bench, and I see no reason for doing it now. Deputy D.A. Conkling spoke up here, offering a sheriff's deputy with a horse and buggy to go wherever the defense needed him to. We are not furnishing the people's officer with our defense here to go anywhere, said Guthrie. Name some other man you want, Conkling said, and I will see that the man has a horse and buggy and starts out forthwith. Here, Judge Smith put the kibosh on it with, proceed, gentlemen. James Carter was recalled by the prosecution. Again, he lived across the street from William and Mary, and that night, it was dark by then, he said he watched from his house, which was about 30 to 40 yards away, John Craig, wearing a gray suit, walk casually up to the porch of the Hunter home, where the couple sat. He commenced shooting and shot 5 shots in rapid succession, he told the jury. At the 3rd shot, Mrs. Hunter screamed, "Murder!" at the top of her voice. It was this shot, Carter said, that killed Mr. Hunter. She screamed again, then 2 more shots, the 5th one striking her. Then it was quiet, and he didn't see Craig, saying he was down below the hedge fence. Carter started to go across the street toward the house when he heard a 6th shot, so he turned back around, then 2 more shots. At the last shot, 2 men ran over to the house, a, quote, Spanish boy and an Italian, who picked up John and was carrying him away. This is where it got a little convoluted. Miles Long had testified at the inquest and preliminary hearing that he was the first on the scene and was assisted by an Italian named G. Di Stefana. But Long was not a Spanish boy. But according to Carter, he arrived on scene and said he heard John saying, "This is terrible," and named Frank Ilasada as the Spanish boy. He said Ilasada told him to get John's hat, to which Carter replied, "I will get a son of a bitch of a rope to hang him." He then took a look at the bodies, noted to himself they were both dead, then went back home. The defense tried to show that the darkness and the distance between their homes would have made it impossible to see what happened, or the color of his suit. The defense had difficulty tripping Carter up, and when he said he had been partially paralyzed for a year and a half, Guthrie replied, "Your tongue isn't paralyzed, is it?" "No, sir," he said, "nor his arm was it neither that night." Guthrie then tried to get Carter to admit that John once arrested him for vagrancy, but he denied it repeatedly. Frank Ilasada testified he saw from across the street John shoot twice at his own head, inflicting the wounds and causing his hat to fly off. Adding to the confusion, he said he was first on the scene with a Frenchman by the name of Pascal, and that he didn't see Miles Long until after Long had telephoned the police. He confirmed he saw Carter, whom he referred to as the N-word, at the scene, and that he did make the rope comment. Then Miles Long said he was first to arrive, along with an Italian named Stefano. Without much at their disposal, the defense could only make as many objections as possible, vital for the appeal. The defense had a lot to overcome in order to win over the jury. John Stone Jones began his argument by showing the many instances where John had reason to fear George. There was also evidence that he and Emily were on speaking terms before the murders. Jones didn't linger too long on trying to explain the mysterious appearance and disappearance of Dwight Ollie, but stuck with the contention that that was why John procured the guns and the buggy. Jones pointed out that John stopped to see if George Payne would come with him. Why would someone hell-bent on carrying out murder bring a witness? Jones reminded the jury that witnesses for the prosecution had said that Emily never expressed fear for her own life, but just that of her children. And while John had a quarrelsome demeanor, no one ever heard him express ill feelings toward her. Several other witness accounts described how John kept his cool when around the Hunters, out at the ranch on June 19th, and the two run-ins in town with George. Attorney Guthrie then picked apart the testimony, calling out inconsistencies, starting with George Hunter, whose memory was less than stellar. The defense also said it would have been impossible for the shot to have been fired, as Tina alleged. Tina and Willie said George stepped outside when he was shot, and that the screen door started to close. Tina said partially closed, and that Emily stooped to catch George, but how could she have caught him through the screen door? Furthermore, Dr. Cole, who examined Emily's body at the scene and performed the autopsy, said the bullet's trajectory after it entered under her left eye stayed level as it went through and out the back. If she had been stooping, the bullet would have traveled downward. Guthrie reminded the jury of the inconsistencies between Willie's testimony at the coroner's inquest and the trial. The threats, being under the bed or not, being able to see George and John on the porch, noting whether his father had a coat on or not, his father talking to Johnny and kissing Edna, and whether or not his father even said anything. Guthrie told jurors that a first-degree murder verdict required malicious intent, and that, quote, the circumstances must be sufficient to excite the fears of a reasonable person, and the defendant, when he shot at the witness, George Hunter, must have acted under the influence of fear alone. It is not necessary, however, to justify such killing that the danger be actual. It is enough that it be an apparent danger, such an appearance to the defendant's mind and comprehension at the moment of the shooting, that his life was in danger. Conkling began the prosecution's closing. They say that accidents never run singly, and it seems that if an accident occurred up there at the ranch on the 25th day of July of this year, about 7:30 or a little earlier, Another horrible accident happened down here at the house to William and Mary Hunter, and it is strange that happened here in the city and happened in about the same time that the other happened out there, outside the city, and it happened in the same manner that the defendant, John Craig, with 2 pistols upon his person, came up to the house, and as deliberately as a man could, in regard to any case, pointed his pistols at those 2 people and killed them. Prosecutors asked the jury to ponder why John Craig didn't just seek legal assistance in regard to his children. He had received $25 that morning from the marshal's office, plenty to secure legal help. Why didn't he wait the few minutes for Jane, the neighbor? Then Mr. Bowler's testimony. Go and get the gun. I know the law, and I have to make a defense. Mr. Gage looked at the jury and said, a man cannot arm himself with 2 revolvers and then say, I thought he was going to kill me. But Craig was trespassing, Gage said, and with 6 shooters on the doorsteps of George's home. Was George to immure himself in his house when an armed man comes and challenges him to come out? The right of defense adheres to George Hunter's breast as well as in that of the defendant. Gage then attacked John's contention that he stood 8 feet from the door when George came out. But the powder burns on the victims' faces indicated they were shot at close range. Accidentally, defendant contended he met his friend. Accidentally, he got the pistols. Accidentally, he failed to take Payne with him to the ranch. And on his own statement, this combination of accidental circumstances, being opposed to human experience and human reason, is not worthy of belief. Then Gage turned up the drama, saying, cold-blooded assassin, cold-blooded on the stand, cold-blooded always. His wife, William Hunter and Mary Hunter. He slew everybody that had ever stood between him and those children in the Hunter family. Now that line was why the prosecution needed all of the murders to be brought up at trial. Mr. Guthrie stood. We accept the remarks made by counsel where he calls the defendant a cold-blooded assassin. It took the 12 jurymen 23 minutes to return with a guilty verdict. John looked haggard and stood with his back to members of the Hunter family. He only closed his eyes when he heard the verdict. Was it fancy, or did the look of pain and pity on the faces of the ladies of the Hunter family as they looked at the defendant, wrote one reporter, mean any pity for him? If so, then so much to their credit, for while the law was being vindicated, the ebb had set in for a human life. The public was certainly happy. I think the LA Times summed up what everyone felt when they wrote, "It is not only the right, but it is the duty of society to protect itself against fiends as John Craig by depriving them forever of the power to commit further crimes. The sentence of death is a terrible punishment, but not so terrible as a crime which it will expiate. The whole community will feel a sense of grateful relief when the sentence has been executed in Craig's case." John didn't seem too bothered by the verdict, but refused to talk to reporters. He spent his time playing cards, talking pleasantly with the jailers, sleeping well, and he had a healthy appetite. When he arrived for sentencing, he apparently didn't look well, though, unshaven and nervously chewing a toothpick. Judge Smith was actually ill, so proceedings ended and sentencing was postponed until December 8th. You may recall the significance of that date from earlier in the story, Emily's birthday and their wedding anniversary. It was as if Emily herself pulled some divine strings so she could exact some poetic justice, a little birthday present to herself. Smith denied the defense's motion for a new trial, told John to stand, and said, "It is not in my heart to say one word that can add to your unfortunate situation. The strings and whips of a guilty conscience are far beyond words, and I will not add to the torture you are enduring. In common with all well-thinking people, I think your position is one deserving of commiseration. While detesting the crime, there can be only pity for one who could so forget his manhood and commit a heinous crime such as that for the commission of which you have been convicted. In some respects, it has not a parallel in the annals of criminal procedure. Rushing on your victim with ferocity, you shot her down without mercy. One might have thought the innocent babes, whom you professed to love so much, might have reminded you that she who stood before you was their mother, and yet you slew her in their presence and then fled away. For such crimes, there is but one punishment: death. Smith didn't set a date, knowing that an appeal would delay it anyway. John would remain in the local jail while awaiting his appeal. He played endless games of solitaire and didn't speak very much with anyone. The guard that now watches in the cell during the night, read one report, has not established friendly relations, and the only ones apparently capable of moving the heart of the prisoner is his kids. All the affection he is capable of expressing, he seems to have for them alone. In May of 1895, a woman reporter for the Los Angeles Evening Express, the article didn't provide her name, went to the jail to interview another inmate, the notorious train robber, William Thompson, known as Kid Thompson. The headline read, "The woman reporter of the Express locked in." Chances are it was Harriet Child Wadley, who was a staff reporter for the paper during that time. For a short stint in the mid-1890s in California, train wrecking was made a capital offense, and Kid Thompson was also facing the death penalty. And weirdly, he and John Craig shared the same birthday, June 9th. After interviewing Kid, the reporter saw Craig leaning against the side of a nearby cell. He was in his shirt sleeves, she wrote of John. He looked lithe and sinewy, and he glanced at me with something that he intended should be a smile. I thought of the young wife whom he shot through the screen door of the little house out in the country, and the two old people whose lives went out suddenly before his pistol on Buena Vista Street. She remarked to him how he had been in jail for a long time. He shifted his position, she wrote. He folded his arms across his chest. His lips parted again in this thing he intended should be a smile, and replied, "Yes, I have been in here a long time, but I do not mind it. I sleep well, I eat well, I can smoke, I'm well taken care of. Why, I could have gotten away easily enough when I was downstairs in that cell. There was only one guard. I could have killed him easily enough, seized the keys through the bars, and been out in a minute." Certainly a John Craig thing to say. He always wanted people to see him as a strong, capable man who's no coward. Of course he could escape. "But you did not do it," she said. "No, I did not do it because I thought it would be against my case to try to escape. I expect to be acquitted." He told her how he thought himself justified, that his wife didn't trust him, and that his in-laws were always interfering. He said he didn't do it for revenge, that he had done wrong, but other men had done wrong too. John had another interesting cellmate a few days later, an astrologer named H.E. Howland, awaiting trial on perjury charges, and he was giving inmates astrology readings. When he got to John, he told the jailer, "Why, he's a murderer. He killed 3 people and came very near being hanged for it. In fact, if his planet had not changed on the 18th of February, he would have been hanged. But he's safe now. This is his lucky year, and he'll never go to the gallows." So he might have been off a little on that one. In August, John filed a petition to have a woman named Adeline Johnson granted guardianship of his 3 children, who were in custody of their Aunt Emily, one of Asa's daughters. The case was continued until November, and meanwhile the children were brought to the jail twice to visit their father. Willie refused to speak to him. John doted on them during the visit and sobbed when they left. When the guardianship hearing came up, John tried to talk to his 2 sons. Edna wasn't there, but the boys evidently wanted nothing to do with him. Deputy Sheriff Martin Aguirre, who would eventually be appointed warden of San Quentin, said The terror and aversion of all of the children to their father is extreme. During the 2 previous visits, Aguirre said Willie wouldn't speak to him, and Johnny might if persuaded. Little Edna, he said, screams herself nearly into convulsions at the sight of her father, whether from fright at the gloomy surroundings or from some blind instinct of terror of the man himself. No one can tell. It wasn't clear how John came to choose this Adeline Johnson, as she was not connected to the family in any way, but she did live very near the Buena Vista house. She was described as unfriendly, and even the kids gave her a wide berth. Willie and Johnny, when asked by the judge who they would like to live with, said they preferred their aunt and uncle. John Craig took the stand in the hearing and said he had heard they were neglected and left without education, and that they were being taught by his mother's people to hate him. He wanted a disinterested person to be appointed guardian who wouldn't tarnish his memory. The judge awarded guardianship to their aunt and said, "As to Mr. Craig's wishes in the matter, they will not be taken into consideration. I do not consider that Mr. Craig's present position entitles him to a voice in the matter, and if they are taught to execrate his memory, it is only part of his just punishment." In March of 1896, less than a month after Ivan Kovalev's execution, John's appeal was denied. Apparently, he took it well, and in April appeared for sentencing, looking happy, fat, and healthy. After Judge Smith sentenced him to hang on June 12th, all he said was, "Thank you," and sat down. His attorneys asked for a 1-day delay in being taken to Folsom so he could have a day to see his kids, but Smith refused. He was given 10 to 15 minutes in a public room in the courthouse to say goodbye to them. Only Johnny, the middle child, spoke to him. The other 2 wouldn't go near him. John kept his composure during the trip to the prison, but once he arrived, he broke down. He told a Sacramento paper, "I have but a short time to live, and anything you say to me will make no difference. But there are my 3 little children. My God, what will become of them? That is all I think about. Those 3 dear ones. The Los Angeles papers have made so much of this, and think how they will feel when they go to school and mix with other children." In early June, John received a letter from his attorney, George Phibbs, with some rather hopeful news. Phibbs had found a man in San Francisco who knew Mr. Dwight Ollie, the mysterious traveling friend of John's. The man met Ollie in San Francisco a few weeks after the murder and talked about the case with him. Ollie allegedly told this man that yes, he had asked John to get some weapons, and they were planning to return late at night and wanted protection. Ollie apparently stated he was sorry he had to leave for San Francisco, saying if he didn't, the tragedy would have been avoided. This other man promised Phibbs he'd testify to this, and that most likely Ollie is back in Chicago. Phibbs informed John that he pleaded his case to Governor James Budd and was awaiting the decision. You would have thought Mr. Ollie would have made contact with John's lawyers then to clear this whole thing up, and yet he didn't. John replied with a letter of his own, riddled with misspellings, something you would expect from a small child. He was glad someone could finally testify that Mr. Ollie was not a myth. He insisted he told the truth during the trial, and just knew the truth would come out in time. But perhaps too late to do me any good, he wrote. But it will help my children, and God knows that there is nothing in this world that I would not do for them. For I love them, and that is one reason that I hate to leave them the way I have to, but I can't help it now. He wrote that he didn't blame the jury. They couldn't have done anything different given the evidence presented, which he felt was unlawful, that Prosecutor Gage and Judge Smith knew as illegal. If I do lose my life for this, he said, it will be one of the most unjust things that ever happened in the United States, and I am not the only one that thinks so either. Well, Mr. Phibbs, I will live in hopes for the best whether it comes or not. I will close, hoping I may hear from you again. But on June 9th, John's 42nd birthday, he received the news Governor Budd would not interfere with his execution. Guards were apparently indulging John's craving for whiskey, giving him the occasional glass to steady his nerves. On June 11th, the day before his execution, John decided he'd try to cheat the gallows by driving a metal wire through his chest, but he only managed to cause himself some great discomfort. He was asked where he got the wire, and he said, "That is nobody's business. A man has a right to kill himself when he wants to." A reporter from the San Francisco Examiner interviewed him that night shortly after and wrote, "It would appear that the badly made fellow loved, as much as a man could love, his children, and sorrowed most at leaving them a heritage of shame, and that he sought to close his life in the cell rather than on the gallows out of somewhat of a considerateness for them, a considerateness that would have spared them the ignominy of being offspring of one who died at the noose." He again swore Emily's death was accidental. "The testimony on the trial will show this," he said. "It will all come out after a while, but it'll do me no good. My 3 children will know then that I did not willfully kill their mother." As the reporter turned to leave, he asked that, for the sake of his children, the press treat him gently in reporting on the particulars of the execution. In the morning, he chose to be baptized in the Protestant faith and, to reporters, maintained that the death of his wife was an accident. He talked about his love for his children, saying how sorry he was for them, that they should have a father who died on the gallows. He refused breakfast, but apparently left a letter for Warden All saying, "These officers have been kind to me as far as they could." As John made the short walk to the gallows from his cell, he appeared ready. Once on the trap, his eyes scanned the crowd below. George Hunter and other members of the family were there. When John spotted Joe Hunter, he yelled, "Oh, Joe, I love you." One paper described it as a sarcastic declaration, but others didn't, so who knows. At 10:02 a.m., he fell through the trap and 11 minutes later declared dead. In addition to showing a broken neck in 2 places, the autopsy revealed that John was pretty close to fulfilling his desire to kill himself. If only he had pushed the wire in a skosh more, as it had in fact just pierced his heart. Enough, doctors said, that he would have likely died in a few days. It was reported that Adeline Johnson visited him at the prison a few weeks earlier. She and George Phibbs claimed John's body, and he was buried at Helvetia Cemetery in Sacramento, which closed in 1912, and in the 1950s, the bodies were moved to other city cemeteries. So, I'm not sure where John's remains are today. As for the Craig children, from what I could find, William, or Willie, was married at age 22, worked as an electrician, but died 6 years later in 1915. I wasn't able to find any documentation about his cause of death. He didn't have any children, and unfortunately his wife also passed young at age 42 in 1933. There's actually quite a few family trees on Ancestry.com with William in them, but the records are mixed in with a different William Craig, this one with the middle name of Augustus. The William Craig from our story had the middle name of John. John Joseph Craig, the middle child, was married twice, the first time in 1917, then in 1928, and they had a son named Jack Hunter Craig Jr. John went to Stanford and Southern California Law School and became a well-known and very well-respected attorney for 35 years. He passed away in 1948 at the age of 60. Edna Emily Craig was married in 1914, but divorced about 10 years later. She appeared to be very close with her brother John's first wife and had a pretty busy social life. She remarried in 1933 and by the looks of it was a housewife and stayed in the Los Angeles area. She was widowed in 1954 and she passed in 1977 at age 85. So I would love to know what you think of this story. Was it possible that John Craig didn't mean to shoot Emily? My own feeling is that I can't say with certainty that he intended to kill her, but I do think he knew he had. If he truly thought he had just killed George in self-defense, or that he could argue it, why make things so much worse for yourself by killing the couple? If he knew, he probably thought, well, I'm screwed. Might as well make it really worth it. He had a lot of resentment toward his in-laws, and he seemed like the kind of guy who blamed others for his choices, so he likely held them responsible for why he just did what he did at the ranch. As for how it happened at the ranch, the various discrepancies between Willie's testimony does give me pause. The inquest was held the very next day, so there might not have been a lot of time for a consensus to be formed among the Hunter family about what happened. I think children have a level of honesty. They just say things because it's the truth to them and because they're taught to tell the truth, while at the same time they're very impressionable. It seemed to me there was a combination of those two things happening with him. Plus, Tina Jensen, the 20-year-old employee of the Hunters and related somewhat distantly by marriage, kind of created a little power imbalance there with the Hunters, so was she coached? If he made up the story about Dwight Ollie, which seems so, he likely knew the neighbor, George Payne, wouldn't be home when he stopped there, or it was a really lucky gamble, and wanted to cast doubt on his intent, which I think is the one element that's difficult to nail down here. Things just could have gone sideways. Who knows, maybe he went there to kidnap his kids, thinking Emily was alone, but then seeing George threw everything off, and given his temper, after his well-laid plan got nixed, he lost it. Again, what are your thoughts? I'm very curious. As I mentioned, the Hunters seem to always find themselves involved in situations. Fights, murders, disputes over land, which is very understandable. They were incredibly shrewd and savvy. That just came with the work they did. I saw a few references that Asa and William were attorneys, or at least had enough legal know-how to conduct some business dealings and lawsuits of their own. For decades, the papers were filled with legal notices involving the Hunters over land, buying, selling, litigating. They knew the law and they had money. I don't think they were bad people, but they might have taken advantage of their power. Joe Hunter seemed to. I'll put a bunch of stuff in the Patreon file because you might be interested in reading about an 1898 murder that happened in Joe Hunter's house on the ranch that he was acquitted for. Joe was a real piece of work. And the more I learned about him, the more I realized why he and John Craig allegedly got along so well. Joe Hunter was just under 2 years older than George and was a constable, a sheriff's deputy, in LA during the 1890s. He was known as a heavy drinker, and his house on the ranch was where everyone went to party. The papers referred to these as pure debaucheries. It was the perfect location, 3 miles outside the city, and within half a mile that seedy saloon, the 3 Mile House. And he had a lot of friends in the sheriff's office, including Deputy Sheriff Martin Aguirre, who, by the way, in 1889 was the first Latino sheriff in LA County, and he and Joe were pretty tight. So a body was found underneath his house, and a young guy staying at the house was blamed. Not to say he wasn't involved, but I'm quite certain Joe had played a role, but he had friends in high places. Even so, I was astounded when he was acquitted, but I also didn't do a deep dive into it. He had resigned from the sheriff's office during the trial after he disappeared for about a year in Arizona to do some work and came back. He was 41, and then he married a 17-year-old Hispanic girl. He had been married to a woman named Susie, but I'm not sure what happened to her. Hopefully, she got out alive. His second wife sued for divorce 5 years later, citing cruelty. Twice, I found references to him skipping out on a lodging bill, and when he was a constable, he punched the wife of the 3 Mile house's owner to the point of unconsciousness because she had the nerve to demand he pay his outstanding bill. George and Joe owned some land in Calabasas where they were, quote, looked up to as little kings by the Spanish population of that nook of the San Fernando Valley. Joe was referenced in an article as the King of Calabasas, as if it were just common knowledge. This was in 1909, and there was an article about a feud between the, quote, Hunter clan and the Chapman clan. It involved Joe taking his shotgun and shooting 200 of John Chapman's hogs for getting loose and eating the Hunter's grain crop. The paper said Joe was on a warpath for pork. The feeling was you didn't mess with the Hunter boys. But that's probably how most disputes of that kind were settled back then. Oh, and about George's daughter who passed, that was in 1910, and she evidently had fallen from a buggy and hit her head. George passed away at age 75 in 1937, survived by George and Walter. Walter had become a captain in the sheriff's office. Joe passed a year later at age 77. His obituary said he was the last of his generation of hunters who were early pioneers, and that he owned farmland in Calabasas for 35 years. Oh, and one last thing before I let you go. Today, you'll find a craftsman-style home referred to as the Hunter Ranch House at 1309 Killarney Avenue in Los Angeles, just on the edge of Elyria Canyon Park. According to a 2019 Los Angeles Department of City Planning document, the 1908 home was built in another part of the city, most likely by Louis B. Easton, an early pioneer of the craftsman style. It was moved in 1955 to Bridgeport Drive onto land previously owned by the Hunters, where Elyria Canyon Park is today, but the name of the land was still referred to as the Hunter Ranch. The home was moved again in 1987 to where it is today on Killarney Avenue, and in 2022 was designated a historical cultural monument. So the Hunters didn't actually have any connection to this particular home, yet it's been 178 years since Jesse D. Hunter arrived in California, and just as their family crest declared, they continue on. Okay, that is it. For the next episode, I'm going to do things a little differently. I'll be discussing the next 5 stories. The executions were carried out between June 19th of 1896, a week after Craig's execution, and August 13th the following year, and it made sense to combine them. I'll be starting with Folsom's 4th execution, Paulo Kamaunu, who was actually the very first prisoner on Folsom's death row, entering on September 25th, 1894. Chin Hain was awaiting his appeal outcome in the city jail in Sacramento. Ivan Kovalev was roaming Sacramento before killing the Webbers in December, and John Craig was awaiting trial in LA. Kamaunu from Hawaii, known then as the Sandwich Islands, was described as a handsome specimen of manhood. Kamaunu had worked for the Sandwich Islands' late king, Kalakaua, and his successor, Queen Kapiolani, who tried to intervene with his execution. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also leave a review, and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on my Substack page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll be able to listen to each episode. Find the show on YouTube as well. Check the show notes for links. Join me every first and third Friday of the month, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.